We welcome back, or welcome to the podium for the first time, the real Rob Suggs, to learn about the history of the Bible. And thank you for offering this gift to us these Wednesdays of January.
Thank you. I always worry about having to follow my wife's act on anything. And I told her this is going to just be a big letdown after, her extravaganza of last week. Whatever it was she did. I don't know whether she sang and danced or what, but I know it was amazing. Let me ask you this. What are your earliest childhood memories? I mean, 3 and 4 years old, when you're really little. Have you ever thought of how few things we remember from when we were really small? It's just most of it's gone. I mean, I can't remember too much from the first couple or 3 years of my life, but I can tell you one thing I do remember, one of my earliest, and we lived just around the corner off Lindbergh Drive in those days. I was about 4 years old, and one Sunday morning, we were sitting in the living room, and Gospel Jubilee was on TV. You remember the guy with the frog voice bass singing Jubilee, and there was nothing else on Sunday mornings. But my mother was struggling to get my older brother to wear his bow tie. I would wear mine without much of a fight. And she said, read your second son his Sunday school lesson, because I was too young to read. So my dad read me the Sunday school lesson on our way to, we were going to get that morning at Second-Ponce, and it was, if you remember, it was Samuel and as a little boy in the temple, hearing the voice of hearing the voice of God. And it wasn't the temple actually in those days; it hadn't been built yet. But Samuel woke up at night and he heard this voice, and it was he went to Eli and said, "Did you call me?" He said, "No, I didn't call you. Go back to sleep." And it happened 3 times. And finally, Eli said, "Go back to sleep. That's God calling you." Well, that wouldn't make me go back to sleep, but my dad told me read that story to me, and I said, "Now let me tell you the story." And I repeated the story back to him, just maybe not word for word, but it had that children's story thing to it, where something happens 3 times and then a punchline. Jokes and children's stories and certain things all have that pattern, and I liked that, and I loved telling him a Bible story. Now I can tell you, I don't remember the first time I threw a baseball, or the first time I actually enjoyed eating a vegetable, or the first time I did a lot of normal things that you might remember. Those all faded from memory, but for some reason, that memory stuck with me, and I remember it vividly. This incredible pride I felt that I had heard and shared a Bible story. And it stuck with me as I grew up in Sunday school here at church. We had some of the best, Sunday school teachers for children, still do. And every week I looked forward to the story. And then one day, my dad was the Sunday school teacher in 5th grade, and I was so proud. And I can still remember the lesson he taught that morning, and it was about Gideon, and it was called "When the Chips Were Down." 5th grade, and I can remember that. Why is that? It meant something to me. The Bible was somehow calling to me, even back then. And so that when I went through school and I had classes on the Bible, I was eager to take them. Everybody else, I don't want to take a Bible class at school. I went to a private school where you could teach those. And so I was delighted to have a Bible class. And it took all the Bible stories and put them in order and showed you how the whole thing was one big story. And I was just compelled by that. So as you look, we were thinking about this tonight at our table. You can just almost tell people's gifts by the way they behave over a meal. There's always somebody at your table that gets up and picks up everybody else's plate and takes it. They have the gift of service, and there's always someone else that's an administrator, and there's just different people have different gifts. And I don't know how this fits into a gift, but I always was drawn. I'm a Bible person. There are prayer people, there are Bible people, there are fellowship people, but this was just always my thing. And so when I was asked a few months ago, whatever it was now, to write this book on how we got our Bible just out of nowhere from a publisher I've never worked with, it felt like it had to just come from somewhere. And I was very excited to do it, so I volunteered to help me in my preparation, to force me, kind of give me a jump start into my research to teach it here first. So what you're getting is kind of a basic kind of a very basic, bare bones outline of what's in the book. The book hopefully will be a book everyone can read and enjoy. It won't be written for scholars and professors. It'll be written for just everyday people, maybe even children to some extent. But it's going to tell where the Bible comes from, what it is, and how to read it. So, if I can master this clicker, we're going to talk about a sigh of relief from Gail. Okay. We're going to talk tonight about the New Testament. Gail talked to you a little bit about the Old Testament last week. What the Old Testament is, how they wrote it in the old days, what the writing materials were, where it comes from. So we're going to talk today about the New Testament, what it is, and we're going to talk not so much about who wrote it, but and then can we trust it? We'll talk a lot about that. So let's see here. There we go. First of all, I want to address this, and there's a reason. Why ask the questions? Why should you care what the Bible is and whether we can trust it? I've had people ask me that in Sunday school classes. I've said, I've taught, here's why we can believe the resurrection really happened. And they'll say, well, I don't need to know that. The Bible says it, and I believe it. I have faith. So if you just have faith, why should you ask the questions? Number one, because I think it's just natural for us to wonder. It's natural sometime to ask the question. It's my belief that we probably have a huge number of people in churches everywhere, this church and other churches, that have questions and they're just kind of afraid to ask them. I've had people tell me that. Would it be okay if I asked a question? I don't want to upset you by asking it because they're afraid the teacher won't be able to answer it or something. Or they'll come across that one question that for 2,000 years no one thought of that will bring the whole thing tumbling down like an avalanche. That could happen. Someone will come with that question that'll make the Bible, the whole thing will be torn apart. So no, it's natural for us to wonder, and we need to ask the question. Also because we need to believe. The time comes when you need to be able to know whether you can trust God or not. Well, there's another thing we talked about at our table tonight, those personal moments that you have when it comes down to, can I trust God? I've talked about God all my life, but now I need to find out whether I can trust him or not. Excuse me. So third, we need to ask the questions because we might be asked. We might be asked. The New Testament tells us to have a defense prepared. And what happens when you say, come to my church with me? We have the greatest church anywhere. We have the greatest pastor, the greatest music ministry, the greatest people. And they say, well, why should I believe in any of that stuff you teach at your church? Well, I don't know. I believe it. I don't know. I don't know why, whether any of it's true, but I believe it. We need to be able to know why. We need to be able to prepare a defense. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is it? What is the New Testament? Context. The context of the New Testament is this. The Old Testament, which you talked about last week, ended, and there are 300 silent years. 300 silent years, which were the loudest silent years in the history of the world. They were not silent at all, actually. You'll remember that at the end of the Old Testament, Israel and Judah had been ripped apart, taken off into slavery by Assyria and Babylon, respectively, and then many people released to come back home. The temple was in shambles. The city walls were in shambles. Nehemiah set about rebuilding the walls. The prophets were speaking, but it was the New Testament ends on sort of a downer. It's not a happy ending book, is it? If you think of it as a book, the Old Testament. So the 300 silent years, this would be a topic for a whole other study session because a lot of things happened. Basically, Israel got conquered several more times by the Greeks, by I think the Seleucids, by several other, finally by the Romans. But several other armies came through and conquered Judah and Israel in that area because they were so weakened by that time. So all of this happened during this period of time. The law begins to get weaker. People begin not celebrating the Sabbath anymore. They begin not paying attention to purity laws. And because of that, groups like the Pharisees arise. The Pharisees, what was their concern? People aren't obeying the purity laws. People are working on the Sabbath. So you see, the Pharisees weren't necessarily the bad guys that took Jesus on. They come across that way very often. But their concern was, we need to get back to that good old-time religion. You see, the good old time religion was the days of David and Moses and Abraham, and when we obeyed our laws and we did what we were supposed to do, we got to get back to that. So the Pharisees rose, the Sadducees, there were all kinds of these groups that appear suddenly in the New Testament that aren't in the Old Testament at all. And then, of course, the biggest change of all is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire, the rise of the Romans happens, just to give you a little context there, it's 44 BC is the year Julius Caesar was stabbed in the rotunda, which is one of the most painful places you could be stabbed, I'm told. I don't know. But he was stabbed in the rotunda in 44 BC, and Julius Caesar was the first of the Roman emperors, considered the first proper Roman emperor, proper or improper, however you want to take it. So by the time Christ is born, it's about 35 to 40 years after that. And Christ comes into the world, Augustus Caesar was and long about that time, Israel has been invaded and taken over. Now, the Jews liked the Greeks, but they hated the Romans. Because the Greeks said everyone can have their own religion and believe what they want. But we want to contribute a language you can all use, etc. And here are some nice statues we've made. The Romans came in and they upset everything. They came in with their army. They didn't respect worship places. So the rise of the Romans was an incredibly traumatic thing, and it increased this desire people had for the Messiah to appear. And so in the midst of all of this, there's one final prophet. When we've been told by Josephus the historian and others that there had been no prophets for 300 years. God had stopped speaking. That's why they're the silent years. It's not that the people were silent. They believed God was silent. But there's this one final prophet that comes along, and he's John the Baptist, or John the Baptizer, if you don't want to claim him for a particular denomination. And John the Baptizer was very much in the mold of the Old Testament prophets, but he's looking forward to Jesus coming after him. So here's this guy that's fascinating to me because he has a foot in each testament. He has a foot in the Old Testament, a foot in the New Testament. Writers will tell you there's something called a transition sentence. You're writing a paragraph, and then this paragraph is about a different subject. A transition sentence keeps it from being an abrupt shift. It fits into both paragraphs. So John the Baptist is the transition sentence of the Old and New Testaments, and therefore of the Bible. John the Baptist talks about a Messiah to come. And at some point, this thing is supposed to, there we go. Now, let's talk about the New Testament writings that begin to come along after he talks about this Messiah. What were the first New Testament writings to be written? Anyone know? Letters to Paul, very good. You can tell the people that were in our class that we had in the past couple months, right? Normally people, when they hear this question, it's like, oh, the Gospels, because Jesus comes first, and then Paul comes after that, right? And that's true. But in terms of the order of writing, Paul wrote everything first. He wrote his letters first, and then the Gospels begin to come after that. So just to give you a little bit of a time frame here, 30 to 33, really maybe 29 to 33, depending on who you talk to, is when we think Jesus was crucified. So that's the time frame of Jesus' crucifixion, 30 to 33. And then having some real, there we go. 53 AD, 20 years after Jesus' crucifixion, Paul writes his first letter, which we believe is 1 Thessalonians. And then about 57 to 8, he writes his magnum opus, which is Romans. So you see, this is all happening close to the period when the events in the Gospels occurred. Now, what you hear today is from people that are skeptics will say Jesus is a tall tale. They'll say, it's just one of those tall tales that he was a good man, and over the years people began to attribute all these powers to him, and then they said he did miracles, and then they said he rose from the dead. Well, C.S. Lewis, who was an expert on ancient literature, said, people who say that don't understand ancient literature and legends. It takes 100 years, 200 years for a legend to develop. They don't just happen overnight. They don't happen while people are still alive that knew the person you're telling the legend about. So you see, I put it this way. When I first began teaching this, I would say, remember the Kennedy assassination? That was 25 years ago. Well, now Kennedy assassination is, 50 years ago or so. So I would say instead, remember 9/11. 9/11 doesn't seem so terribly long ago, was it? I mean, you could talk to a lot of people that remember that. And that was 2001, so that's 22 years ago this year. So that's about the same period of time between 911 and now that Paul's first letters were the gospel. Now, why is that important? Because Paul talks all the time about a resurrection. He talks all the time about the basics of our Christian faith. So within 20 years, there was an early church community that already had firmly developed what we consider the basics of Christianity. So it was all there. So the Gospels. I've spoiled my question. I was then going to say who wrote the first gospel, but my people from that class would get that one too. So for many, many years, people ignored the Gospel of Mark. I mean, I admit I used to. For hundreds of years, scholars believed Mark was a Reader's Digest condensation of Matthew. You know how you'd have like a big old book by James Missioner, but you'd read the Reader's Digest condensation, which was half as long? Mark seemed to have everything that was in Matthew, but it just not as much detail, and it leaves out the Sermon on the Mount, and leaves out all these other things. Well, over time, people began to do the study, and they would say, that's not what happened at all. Matthew and Luke copied off of Mark. So what they do with Matthew and Luke came along, and they had some things that had not been included in Mark. Mark is a short, terse gospel. The main word in the word Gospel of Mark is immediately, straight away, I think in the King James. Jesus went straight away out of the water and into the wilderness. He's running everywhere. He's in a hurry. So that's Mark. Mark is writing the earliest of all the Gospels, probably in 69 or so. Peter Ray Jones believes the year before the temple came down, which was 70. So he sets it in 69, which I think is a good guess. We don't know for sure. None of the Gospels mention the temple coming down. So, it could be that they just didn't want to talk about it, and they wrote after it, but they just, for whatever reason, they don't mention it. So Mark comes along, and Mark is, we think, more and more. This used to be just a theory, but it's grown in evidence over the years. Mark contains the memoirs of Peter. Mark, if you'll remember, was associated with the Apostle Paul. He traveled with him, but then he was associated with Peter after that, and was apparently with him when Peter died. And one of the early church fathers tells us that Mark spent his time with Peter and wrote down everything Peter remembered, just not in order. That's almost word for word what he said. So Mark comes first. He writes down the reminiscences of Peter. Matthew and Luke come next with their different emphases. Each of the Gospels has a different emphasis. Matthew presents Jesus as the king who is the prophesied Messiah. The big phrase in Matthew is, this happened to fulfill the prophecy. Then Mark is, here's what Jesus did, and I need to tell you this immediately. Luke is a beautiful gospel that shows Jesus the compassionate, Jesus who loved people, Jesus who paid attention to women in a culture when no one else did. That's Luke. And Luke, of course, also has those two amazing parables, the prodigal son and the good Samaritan. So the final gospel to be written is John. John is around 90. And John says, well, those kinds of gospels have all been written. I'm going to write about what it all meant. So John is a theological gospel. He has 7 miracles, which he calls signs. He has 7 I am statements of Jesus. And he builds everything around festivals. John is very literary. That's why he tends to be my favorite gospel. You can read a story out of John 5 different times and get something different every time. There's a saying that a child could wade in the Gospel of John and enjoy himself and get lots of stuff out of it, and the wisest scholar could dive into it and not get to the bottom. And that's the way John is. It can be read by children. That's why we give John to people that don't know much about Christianity. Now, Acts comes a little later. It's Luke part 2, and then come the later epistles, and then comes Revelation. We're not going to have time to get into all these, but the later epistles come near the end of the first century. And there's a lot of discussion also that we could get into about who wrote what. We're not really going to do that. Paul wrote most of what is thought to have been the writings of Paul. There's 1 or 2, for example, the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, that reflect such an advanced church government. Elders and deacons, in deacon time, we always talk about 1 Timothy. All of that developed toward the end of the 1st century. So it was attributed to Paul by the early church. But when you do when you look at the church government, and then you compare the vocabulary of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus is entirely different. It's like a whole different set of words used that aren't the typical Paul words and Paul expressions. Now, there's an explanation for that. It could be that Paul he was getting older and he got someone to write it for him. So there's other things to consider, but these are the things that the scholars quibble about. Now, the final thing we want to talk about, and I think the most important, is can we trust it? I'm supposed to go till what, 7:45? 7:50? 7:30? 8 o'clock. 8:30. Do I hear 8:45? Okay. You're watching the clock. We're doing okay? Okay. This is the question, more so now than ever. There was a time maybe in the 1950s and the 60s where we went to all our church meetings and our Sunday school classes. Everybody we knew went to church, it seemed like, and you didn't get into a lot of arguments about what was true and what was not in the Bible, because people just didn't behave that way. It was uncalled for. But now in the age of the internet, nothing's uncalled for. And you read letters to the editor, and you read these articles that come up. And I mean, even you turn on the TV and you'll see the National Geographic, and the National Geographic channel will have another Easter time special on, can we believe that there ever was a Jesus? And what about this new Gospel of Judas that we just discovered? And that's the thing, by the way, the Gospel of Judas. They're always finding some new gospel that was written about 600 AD usually. And, they're asking the question, maybe this is the one that's right, the one written in 600 AD, rather than the ones written within 20, 30 years. So we have all these questions that come up, and a lot of the questions are asked by people that don't really have their facts straight. And as an example, there's absolutely no doubt, and I can tell you this, there's no doubt Jesus existed. If you hear anyone say Jesus never existed, he's like, I don't want to spoil, I was about to say the tooth fairy. I'm just going to. If anyone says that there wasn't really a Jesus, like there wasn't really a King Arthur or a Robin Hood or whatever, just laugh at them. Because the most skeptical scholars admit that there was a Jesus. There is extra biblical evidence of Jesus. I mentioned Josephus before. Josephus was a Jewish historian that lived around the time of Paul, actually, so just like a half generation after Jesus. Josephus was interested in writing for the Romans and defending the Jewish faith. He wrote a book called Against Appion, which he's challenging someone named Appion, I don't know what, but it was a polemic. So in other words, it was this is to defend Judaism. And he's also the first person that mentions the Old Testament canon. So he says, these are the books that Hebrews use, and it's identical to what we use today for our Old Testament. He's one of the first to do that. But Josephus was not a believer in Jesus, but he mentions Jesus. He says Jesus was a wonder worker. He says there was a wonder worker about that time. Isn't that interesting? He not only admitted Jesus, but he admitted that Jesus did some interesting things. And he wrote this right around the time Paul did. There are other mentions of Jesus. There's just no doubt. There's just no doubt about that. So what we want to talk about into this category is, number one, what about the Gospels and letters that weren't included? I just mentioned that there are some Gospels. Have anyone ever heard of some of these extra Gospels or extra epistles? The Gospel of Thomas is a very important one. It's one of the earliest of them. So therefore it has a little more gravitas to it than some of the ones written much, much, much later. What happened was it was popular in culture to write a book after the style of someone. So you could write a book and you could sign Paul's name to it. It wasn't looked upon as negatively as we'd look upon that today. We'd look upon that as being a lie or, whatever, even though that's what I do for a living. But is writing books with the other people's names on. But the point is, there were many books as Christianity was made more popular that were imitation gospels and imitation letters. Now, some of them were by very good people and are still read today. There is, I didn't bring along a list of them, but you can read these online. It's called the Early Church Fathers. The Early Church Fathers were early Christians, and they wrote a lot of letters that could almost be in the Bible, but they're not because they weren't considered inspired. But these are letters about church practice. There's one called the Shepherd of Hermas, Hermas, and I have no idea whether I pronounced that right. It's delightful to read. It's a very early Christian book. These are not biblical books, but they just about could be, and there's nothing heretical in them. But these weren't the ones considered to be inspired, and I'll tell you after all. But there are others that I know you're going to go to that next slide. If I have faith. There we go. Okay. Helps to put your thumb on the right button. So, the early church fathers determined which books were used in worship. And some people like to say, oh, the early church fathers had an agenda. It was a political thing, or the Emperor Constantine did it, and some of these things. But what they did was they would pick up writings, because there were lots and lots of writings around. And remember, the Jewish culture was, hopefully Gail talked about, was very, very literary. It was very into writing. And the early church was largely made of Jewish believers. So there were lots and lots and lots of letters, and probably a lot that are just lost to history. So the early church fathers would say, what can we use in worship? There are a lot of stories of Jesus. Which ones can we trust? The first thing they looked at was apostolic credentials. So when they arranged their New Testament, they would put the 4 Gospels first, because these were the stories passed by the apostles. In some cases, written by the apostles. But apostolic credentials. And this is why Paul fought for his credential as an apostle. He said, I am Paul the apostle, because I saw Jesus if not the first time Jesus was here. So, number one, were you a disciple, or were you closely associated with a disciple? And number two, they look at the book and say, does this have accepted beliefs of Christianity? Now, there were apocryphal gospels and letters. Many of them were written 200 or 300 years after the books in our canon. So people, what they do is they study these, and they're able to determine the age of them. And there were gospels being written in the Middle Ages. There's a famous gospel, I don't know when it was written, 400 or 500 or 600, about Jesus as a little boy. Now, haven't you always wondered, I wish we had a few little boy stories of Jesus. This gospel gave you some. Jesus takes a clay pigeon. He builds a pigeon out of clay. He touches it, and it flies off into the air. That's a beautiful story. It's just that it never happened, But who cares? It never happened. So those gospels are not in the Bible. The early church fathers knew that. And then the other thing was, a lot of these gospels promoted Gnosticism and other fringe beliefs. Now, Gnosticism will take a while, once again, to explain. Gnosticism was, the best comparison is, you remember a few years where people were real worried about New Age beliefs, and there was, all these New Age beliefs are getting into everything. And that's such a broad category. They're basically a bunch of beliefs, so transcendental meditation and this and that, and reincarnation, a whole lot of things that come over from the East. But that's a real broad category. Gnosticism was like that. It was a general wave of belief. One of the main beliefs was that all material reality is evil, and all spiritual reality is good. That's just a non-biblical belief. There's good and bad spiritual, and there's good and bad physical. And it's not the Christian doctrine. So Gnosticism, therefore, they would try to write a gospel. There's a gospel, I think, it might be in the Judas one, I'm not sure. I remember reading it recently, in which, they make a big point that Jesus, when you try to touch him, he wasn't really there. Because if he'd really been there, he would have been sinful, say by Gnosticism, because the flesh is totally evil. So what they had to do was explain away his physical presence and say it was an illusion. The early church grappled with these issues for about 300 years, by the way. And that's what the early church councils were about. The Council of Nicaea, some of these councils and the creeds, the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, these came out of the need to say, what do we believe about Jesus? And what they came to was that Jesus is the second person of the Trinity. He is 100% human and 100% divine. And the math doesn't add up, but this is God we're talking about. He's fully human, fully divine. So the Gnostic Gospels would try to kind of play fast and loose with that. There were other books that would try to say he was just a human who became God while he was here. Things like that, so offshoots. So a lot of these books you hear about, They were left out for very good reason. And over 2,000 years, we have never yet found a book that should have been included. You can look at every one of them and immediately see why it was not included in the New Testament canon. By the way, canon, you know that word. The canon means the accepted body of writings. So the canon of the Lord of the Rings is the Fellowship of the Rings, the Two Towers, and the Return of the King. That's the canon, right? And I guess the Hobbit is part of that. The canon is the accepted body of works of a group of writings. And the New Testament canon is the, 29 books, is it? How many books are in the New Testament? I don't know. I should know. Okay. Now, what about the accuracy of the writings that were included? That's at least as big a question that people have. What about the accuracy of the books that were included? Because they say, well, here's the thing. And I've heard this, I don't know how many times in Sunday school. People have asked this. And they've asked it thinking it's there it goes again. Put your thumb on the right button. The telephone game myth. This is the way I always talk about the telephone. I don't want to walk away from the microphone, but I could walk over here and whisper a story to you. You never played the telephone game? And then you would whisper it to somebody else at the table, and they would whisper it to someone else. And by the time it got around, it would be a little bit different. Remember that? You know that game? Anybody? Surely you remember. Oh, okay, good. Some of you do. The idea of the telephone game is generally given to illustrate how truth gets mangled because we're so imperfect. So a lot of people believe that the original Gospels, whatever they said, we don't have the original manuscripts. So therefore, what must have happened is they got copied and then copied again and then copied again and then copied again. And by the time they got to us, we have no idea what they originally said. Haven't you heard that, or maybe you've wondered about that? But the problem is it doesn't work like the telephone game at all. Let's do the exercise again, and it's more like this. I come over and I talk to you and I tell you something. Jesus Christ is Lord. He was, maybe the whole Apostles' Creed or something like that. And so you not only hear it, but you write it down. And then you whisper it to the next person and they write it down. And it goes, well, some of these writings are still going to get things wrong, but we still have the early writings to go back and check. Now, sure enough, we don't have the earliest writings. We have a few late first century writings. We have thousands and thousands of New Testament manuscripts. I think I've got there's thousands of surviving fragments. And I'm going to tell you about, just as an example, the Codex Sinaiticus, the world's oldest complete New Testament. You really need to Google this or go to Wikipedia and read this story. Now, actually, the best story is not the one in Wikipedia, but just find somewhere that talks about how we found out about this. A scholar in the 1830s was visiting a monastery, St. Catherine's Monastery at Mount Sinai. And he was just kind of walking around the monastery, and he found a box or something, an old box, and he opened it up. And there were a lot of old manuscripts in there. Well, it was a whole lot of the Old New Testament, and it was really old. He'd never seen manuscripts this old, and no one had, actually. So over a long period of time, he spent time trying to talk them out of those manuscripts. Oh, no, we've had those around here for a long time. We really don't want them disturbed. Well, can I take them somewhere and copy them? No, we don't. We'd rather you not do that. This could be very important for the history of Christianity. No. There's a lot of arguments on how he finally, most people think that he kind of finagled them because it was so important to him to get these manuscripts. People have continued to find pages. There are just a few pages missing. Into the 21st century, and even a couple of years ago, people found more fragments. Today, the Codex Sinaiticus is in the British Library. It's the world's oldest complete New Testament. It is written, I've got a close-up there because I want you to see there are no spaces between words. They had to value let's say they were not using papyrus. Do you remember from last week? They were using parchment by this time, which is animal skin. But they still had so little of it. And they were creating, instead of scrolls now, they were using codices. This is the Codex Sinaiticus, but it's a codex. So that's the first earliest versions of a book. But they had so much ground to cover, so much to write, and so few animal skins that they would not have blanks between words. Now go home and pick up any book on your shelf and imagine there's no blanks between the words. And think of how dedicated you have to be to read that. And then they would abbreviate a lot of words too. But this has been an absolutely invaluable archaeological find because we have an absolute snapshot of what the New Testament looked like in 400. So we can go back in the middle of the telephone game to 400. We can at least see there what it looked like. So the question is, did it get changed before 400? Does it say that Jesus rose from the dead? Does it say that these miracles happened? Yes.
Your slide says created 400 BC.
Okay, that's another.
Do you mean AD?
AD.
Okay.
Thanks, Gail.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Yeah, no one would have noticed it if you hadn't said something. So, I know Drew would have noticed it. Okay. Just to give you an idea, don't necessarily trust the numbers on these because I have questions about some of them. But Plato, there are 7 surviving ancient copies of Plato, ancient copies. There's still a few in your bookstore in your library. But the ancient copies that were written back in the day, there's like 7 copies, and they were 750 years later. The most thoroughly, the one we have the most copies of outside the New Testament is Homer's Iliad. There are 643 copies from the ancient world of Homer's Iliad. And we believe there's a 95% accuracy to what was originally written. And they have various ways they figure that by comparing manuscripts. The New Testament, there are, just in the Greek, 26,000 manuscripts. Now, it's a whole lot more than that if you can put in other languages and you put in later, the ones that were in the Middle Ages and things like that. But we can discount those. But the early manuscripts, we have enough that we can do cross comparisons. Now, just think about this for a minute. We have copies that were, now we don't have any Dead Sea Scrolls in the New Testament. There were Old Testament manuscripts such as Isaiah and the Dead Sea Scrolls. But we have in a lot of places like that, from around Israel and Judea, copies of the New Testament or parts of the New Testament. Usually it's just a gospel or a writing of Paul. Sometimes it's all of Paul's writings, or sometimes it's several gospels. And sometimes with the Codex Sinaiticus, it's an entire New Testament. Now we can then take that and compare that to another document from Egypt. Now this was all the way over in Egypt, and it was 150 AD, something like that. Now, do you really believe someone went to all around the world, to all these places where these manuscripts, and they changed all those manuscripts and edited them to say that a miracle happened or whatever it is that they changed? No, they didn't do that. We can cross-check gospel against gospel and epistle against epistle. And when you read your Bible, if you have a good study Bible and you read it carefully, they tell you when you can, they say some early manuscripts, look up the Lord's Prayer. I think in Matthew, they'll tell you that the first couple verses aren't in the earliest manuscripts. Now, and I'll give you 2 quick examples. I know I'm running out of time. The ending of Mark and the woman caught in adultery in John. The ending of Mark, the last sentence that we believe is the true last sentence of Mark says, the women went back to their homes terrified. Okay, that's bothered people over the years. It's just a real downer sentence. So there's about 3 other endings were tacked on at different times by different writers. And for a long time, the King James Version just put them right in there. And then scholars started to say, they started to compare them and say, those 3 endings in Mark are not in any of the early manuscripts. So if you have a decent Bible, I don't want to insult your Bible. If you have a good study Bible, it will tell you, there will be some print that says the following, like a hazard sign. These are not in the earliest manuscripts. It's here so that you'll know what the verses were. And then the other one is a lot more curious to me. The woman caught in adultery. He who was without sin cast the first stone. Remember that? Jesus kneeling and writing in the dirt with his finger. Remember that? A lot of pastors won't preach from that passage because it's not in any of the early manuscripts. It's a beautiful story of Jesus. It just captures him, but it's not in any of the earliest manuscripts. So there's a note. The point of all of this is that, we have it. I'm glad we have it in there because it's a good story of Jesus, and a lot of scholars believe it's legitimate and valid. It just someone found it much later and put it in there. But the point of all this is we're able to cross-check things many, many times. And there were a lot of revisions made when people copied Gospels, as opposed to the Old Testament, which was generally done by scribes, and it was just almost flawless. The copies varied not at all. New Testament is different. It's written in an informal language, the Greek of the time, which was the kind of the common street Greek. It was written by informal people, and little mistakes were made. And every now and then a monk would add something that just bothered him, that this particular, that this was left out. But most of them, none of the additions that have been put in by people that we can pick up on ever changed the theology, not a single time. So in other words, there's not, oh gosh, the thing with the Trinity, this was put in. It's all the references that we kind of derive the Trinity from were there from the beginning. It's things like and he and just little words that complete the sentence, that kind of thing. So we believe, and again, the scholars come up with this number, the New Testament manuscripts as they stand are 99.5% accurate. And the 0.5% is generally little things that don't really add up to much. There's one or two interesting passages that scholars can argue about, but none of them would topple Christianity. So, I would leave you with this thought. I told you that I felt the Bible kind of calling to me, just as my thing that I wanted to study all my life. There are no other books. I have a lot of favorite books. I love The Lord of the Rings. I mentioned that. I've never gone back and reread it even once. I probably would enjoy it if I did, but not more than once probably. I don't have any books that I read over and over. I just don't, because there's too many other books to read. But the Bible, I've been reading all my life and studying all my life, and it's never enough. There's always something new in there. There's something special about that book. And if God has had it preserved for us for 2,000 years, if it lasted through the Middle Ages, which I'm going to talk about next week, it lasted through all kinds of weird eras of the church, and we still have the Bible. Somehow, when some other things have passed away, then what does that say to us about the importance of spending some time with this book instead of just kind of leaving it on the shelf between Sundays? What does it say? So, are there any questions as we close? Drew. Oh, there you go.
Okay, maybe this is something you'll talk about next week or the week after, but there are discussions. There are those who say that the last reliable translation of the Bible is King Jim from the 1600s. In fact, they'll put a date on the translation that they believe is the most reliable, and there are errors or unreliable parts of the text from which newer translations were derived. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to talk about that next week?
Yeah, we'll probably talk about that some. I'm going to spend a little time on the King James, which I'm of two minds about. And one of the things is my opportunity to write this book is because of not a new translation, but a new edition of the King James called the KJVER for easy reading. And really all they've done is they've taken out the these and thous and put you in them and things like that. But it's a small publisher. But it's for people that really, really love the King James. And I'm going to tell you why it's special. It's written by people that wanted it to have a Shakespearean poetic feel to it, and it does. You compare a verse in the New International or something to the way it reads in like the 23rd Psalm or something to the King. It just can't. For beauty, nothing can beat the King James. For accuracy, everything can beat the King James. So it's just because there's been so much scholarship since 1611, which is now, 500 years. There's been a lot of scholarship since then. Anything else?
What do you recommend for a good study Bible?
I've always liked the NIV study Bible. Even though I just said it's not, but it's just a really good all-around. There are a lot of newer ones out. And it really depends on what translation you like to use. Do you have a favorite translation?
Well, like King James, I really love
history. I love history, and I
Right.
like to see it denoted, like this is what happened. So
Right. Yeah, that's what a study Bible's for. One to look into is the New King James, which is, don't tell my publisher I said that. Thomas Nelson Publishers publishes the New King James, and it is a translation that tries to preserve some of the poetry of the King James, but is more accurate. So there's a lot of them. There's one, the ESV Study Bible. It's about like this. You'll never survive trying to get to church carrying it. They'll find you somewhere down Piedmont, just weighted down by. So, and one thing we're also going to talk about is the digital word. We're going to talk about computers and the Bible. Anything else?
Rob, you said about how Kennedy shot 9/11.
Yes.
Now we're just having a pandemic, and that just happened a year ago.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. 20 years from now, people will be saying, oh, you young people don't remember the pandemic.
And that affected the whole world.
It did. It affected the whole world. It's an example of the world we live in. Everything affects everything else. Everything's connected. That's the modern world. Good. Anything else?
Also, I thought the telephone game, I heard this, is when you put two cups together with a string.
Yeah. I never tried that. I always wondered how that could possibly work, but I never tried it. But he's talking about taking the two cups or cans, the cans, and connecting them with a wire. And I never. Have you ever tried that? No. Okay. So we don't know. None of us know whether that works or not. Gail, it's time to. Yes. Okay. Let's pray. Gail says, "Let's pray." So let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. You know how we feel about it. This is a church that has honored the Bible for all of its history. It's had a special relationship with your word, and that's been reflected in the preaching, and it's been reflected in the teaching in Sunday school. And it has sent numerous young men and young women off to seminary who were enchanted by what they studied and what they learned, and wanted not only to hear a story, but to tell a story. Like I did when I was 4 years old. There's something about it. It's not enough just to hear it. It's got to be shared. Help us to find ways to share it, but also just give us that jump start to dig into it a little bit, to pick up a book of the Bible we've never studied before and to study it, and show us that we can fully trust your word and your spirit with every care we have in life. We pray these things in your name. Amen.